Surrounded by enemies and with no escape in sight, Samuel and I are forced to confront our deepest fears. When a dark wolf appears above our prison, the tension reaches a breaking point. Chapter 19. Chances Samuel had finished redressing my wound and we now sat in silence. Never-ending, harrowing, deafening silence. I couldn't tell what was going through his mind, and I was sure that I wanted to. He had finally relaxed enough to not involuntarily shift, but he didn't do much beyond that. At the moment, we were both sitting on opposite ends of our dirt hole, lost in our thoughts. It wasn't a good situation for me, as I was trying to avoid thinking. After everything that happened, I knew it was easier to ignore the problem, push away the thoughts and think only of the present. It would do me no good to dwell on the people that betrayed me, or the fact that there was no conceivable way out of this, or the possibility that my family was already dead. Still, images of the past few days seemed to slap me across the face. I felt each and every blow, one for the people it trusted, one for the mistakes it made, one for relying on anyone but myself. They just kept coming. My breath shook as I inhaled deeply, my hands bracing my temples. I glanced up to Samuel, only to see him with his eyes closed where he rested his head against the wall. His knees were bent with his arms relaxing on top of them. He seemed to be in perfect health. There were no memories of the injuries he'd sustained, no scars brandishing his skin from the countless wounds inflicted. He had gotten what he wanted me. That appeared to be the only thing that would ever worry him. The only proof he'd struggled with anything in this situation was the 2 silver bullets buried deep in my pockets. I remembered the tiny things, my hands digging into my jacket as I eyed Samuel warily. When I realized he was still sleeping, I dug out the bullets and held one in my fingers, twisting it close to my eyes. The bullet was half the size of my pinky and silver through and through. To my agent extraordinaire, Love, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. The smell. I played with it for a minute before I balanced it precariously between my thumb and the finger. It was hard to believe something so small had caused so much pain. Then again, it was that hard to believe. There were too many things that seemed too insignificant to do any real damage, whether to body or mind. James' knives, for example, never seemed as deadly as they were. I flinched at yet another unwanted memory, trying to push it back down. He'd done it with this particular memory many times before, so I was sure why it kept coming back to me now. But, no matter how hard I tried, it seemed every thought led back to the name scarred into my back. I thought it moved on from the trauma, but it seemed Samuel had resurfaced the memories. Sure, my body had healed, but my mind was nowhere close. That fact was made evident any time I went near James. Even though I had to limp, I made it a point to always avoid being in his presence. To my agent extraordinaire, Love, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. He would seek me out, and then I couldn't run. He'd be resigned to his drunken beatings. My mother would always try to con him, and sometimes it would work. Most other nights, Will would come home just in time to lock us in his room. But for the most part, he'd gotten used to living in fear. And then, he'd gotten used to living in guilt. Guilt because if it only been stronger, I could have fought him off that night. It would be me in the hospital, and not Will. Samuel's words suddenly echoed through my mind. In going to kill him, I allowed myself to dwell on that thought for a minute, picturing James' demise. I wasn't a violent person, nor did I actively want to murder people, but it was hard to deny the fact that if James was gone then my family's life would be safer. For that reason, I didn't shrink back from the thought of James' death. I welcomed it. If Samuel wanted to kill James, I was going to stop him. "You going to kill me with those?" Samuel's voice suddenly rang out. I flinched violently, sending the bullet he'd been holding tumbling to the dirt. I quickly snatched it back up and shoved it into my pocket. No, just thinking about killing me in my sleep. Maybe. Samuel let out a barking laugh, shifting his weight around. I allowed myself to laugh with him for just a moment. What were you really thinking about? He asked me. To my agent extraordinaire, webnovel. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I seemed to do that a lot during our conversations. I was trying not to think. To my agent extraordinaire, webnovel. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Interesting idea, he mused. I rolled my eyes. Doesn't really work. Well, I honestly could have told you that. Thank you. You're really just such a big help, I told him sarcastically. He laughed again. I know. But, in all reality, why don't you give those to me? He gestured to my pocket. I narrowed my eyes. Why, you can't even hold them. I can handle a little burn. Samantha, he said as he rolled his eyes and shifted to his knees. He glanced upwards as he did, seeming to watch something moving above. I quickly followed his gaze, searching for what he'd been watching. But, the moment I was focused on the space above us, Samuel was at my side and digging the bullets out of my pocket. Hey, I shrieked, swatting at his hands. The moment I fought back, he pulled away. He held a small bullet between his fingers, letting only small parts of his skin touch the material. Sure enough, the skin was burning and blistering almost instantly. Thank you. He smiled as he walked away. Are you kidding me right now? He was back on the other side of the hole now, sitting down once more. I watched as he dropped the bullets into his own pocket. Not kidding. I just know how stubborn you are. Didn't we feel like arguing? You're unbelievable. Oh, you like me and you? He flashed me a large and dizzy grin. Well, there's just so much to like, isn't there? I falsely returned the smile, narrowing my eyes. He laughed again, relaxing his body against the dirt once more. How are you feeling? He promptly changed the subject. Just peachy. In short, that's the truth. I stubbornly stated. I'm fine. You know, you don't have to lie. You were shot. It's all right to feel a little under the weather. He told me matter-of-factly. I said I'm fine. I huffed. He held up his hands. Okay. I'll drop it. Thank you. Anytime. He smiled widely again, wrapping my arms around my torso and looking to the sky. There was much sky to be seen. The only view we had was the large silver bars and countless trees looming over them. Can't you jump out if he or something? I suddenly asked him. He scoffed and raised his eyebrows, following my gaze. It's not that simple. If I were to try, it'd have to be my wolf. And my wolf can't exactly break through solid silver and hold you at the same time. So why don't you go without me? His face lost its humor. He tilted his head and half glared at me. You know I wouldn't ever leave you. Samantha. I'm just saying, if it means getting out of here, it might be worth a try. You want me to leave you alone in this hole so they can shoot you again? Or maybe it's so you can go crawling back to the man who gave you that jacket. I watched his face flinch with anger. To my agent extraordinaire, webnovel. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Just calm down, wolf boy. I'm not exactly going anywhere. And in case you hadn't realized, I'm not exactly the biggest fan of these people. To my agent extraordinaire, webnovel. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. He held my gaze for a minute, clearly unamused. I only shrugged my shoulders, giving him my most innocent look. After a moment of silence, I changed the subject. So, what's the plan then? I slowly asked. Plan? He seemed confused. I started, rolling my eyes. How are you planning on getting out of here? Samuel tight and his lips. Well, I don't really have one. I glared at him. You what? I don't have a plan. He shrugged nonchalantly. Well, how the hell are we supposed to get out then? Do you trust me? Definitely not. I watched Samuel's lips form a soft pout. That hurt. Sammy. My mouth let out a sharp breath as I raised my eyebrows. Number 1, don't call me that. Number 2, can you blame me? He rolled his eyes. If you can call me a wolf boy, then I can call you Sammy. He paused, thinking for a minute. And I haven't done anything to betray your trust yet. Have I? Oh no, of course not. You were only going to force me to move in with you and turn me into a werewolf. I don't see your point. I let out a laugh. Wow, wow. You really don't see anything wrong with that statement. I looked away from him as I shoved my fists into the dirt. My frustration was building. Every conversation with Samuel was the same. We argued, talked in circles, and ultimately gave each other the silent treatment. We acted like the children fighting over their favorite toy. Samuel groaned, rubbing his palms against his eyes. I don't understand you. Well, maybe that's because you've never tried to. He paused his movements, bringing his palms slowly back down to rest on his knees. His eyebrows raised as he frowned, thoughtfully. You know, I guess you're right there. I'm sorry. What? I meant that maybe the reason I don't understand you is that you never open up to me. I paused, amazed at his ability to constantly morph the truth. So, if I'm understanding you right, you think that it's my fault you're a misogynistic dick. He glared at me, then let out a long breath, closing his eyes for a moment and regaining his composure. You know, this road goes both ways. What is that supposed to mean? I practically spat. I mean that if someone wants respect, they have to give it. Why would I give you respect? Why wouldn't you? I narrowed my eyes. Do I have to list the reasons again? Look, Samantha, believe it or not, I know I'm not perfect. But, at least in trying here, I tried to cut him off, but he spoke over me, holding up his hand. If you don't think I understand you, then why don't you explain yourself? I folded my arms tightly across my chest, looking down to the ground. Why should I give you that courtesy when it's never been shown to me? You've never asked. That's not something you should have to ask for. So, I'm supposed to automatically know what you are thinking. He practically growled. I looked up to meet his glance. His face was scrunched up, his eyebrows forming deep lines in between his eyes. He was awaiting my answer like it was his last meal. I finally spat my response. You're supposed to not think of just yourself for once in your life. My eyes met the ground once again. I curled and held his gaze as the emotions ran through his face. They would only distract me. My blood was pumping. My heart was racing. And I was in no mood to lose an argument. After a while, Samuel sighed heavily. His voice was softer now, almost pleading. Samantha, why did you run? His question and caught me off guard, and I froze. What? You said I never asked. Well, in asking you now, I want to know, why did you try and run? I furrowed my eyebrows, staying silent. Answering this question would open a conversation I was ready to have. Samuel seemed to be sincere with his words, but I knew how quickly someone's intentions could change. If I even thought about opening up to him, who's to say he wouldn't turn around and use the information against me? I don't want to answer that. He huffed out a small breath. What do you want? Samantha. I thought for a moment. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. They'll tell you anything I can. He seemed to jump at the suggestion. His frame perked up slightly as his eyes trained holes into my own. I paused, thinking of one question weighing constantly on my mind. Do you know if my family is okay? Seemingly taken aback. Then slowly, he shook his head. Not really. I went looking for you at your house when I knew you were gone. But everything seemed normal. I didn't go back after that. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. A lot could have changed since then. I glanced up to Samuel, who seemed to be waiting for my next question with bated breath. Before I could stop myself, I blurted out the thing that had been pressing on my mind since the first day I saw him. Why me? He hesitated, What do you mean? Why did you pick me? Samuel again seemed surprised by my question. Well, it's not exactly as simple as that. He looked at me, warily. There's a lot of legends behind mates and things. I wasn't even sure I believed them until I met you. And what makes me so special? You got me. I glared at him while he burst out laughing. I'm kidding. I'm kidding. It'll be serious. He paused for a moment, thoughtfully, before continuing. It's said that a mate is supposed to be your perfect other half. The term comes from what you humans used to refer to as soulmates. The feeling is different for everyone, but in the end, it boils down to one thing. When you see your mate, the world changes. Your world magically changed when you met me. It sounds crazy, but yes. Smiling. I know it's weird for you, especially since humans can't feel the mate bond. Trust me, I didn't even believe in this before I saw you. You really believe in your... I grimaced at the word. Mate. Absolutely. I shook my head. You don't even know me. I know you enough to know that you're stubborn. I glared. But, he continued, but more than that, you're caring. I know that would do anything for those you care about. I also know you're brave, smart, and beautiful. I bent my neck and let my hair hide my face in reaction, not knowing what to make of his words. I opened my mouth to make a quick retort, but no words would come out. My entire being was stunned into silence. Samantha, you may not believe me, but I do care for you. I'd do anything for you. All I want is for you to be safe and happy. I heaved a shaky breath. Minutes of silence fell as Samuel awaited my response. He was patient with me, never pushing the words out. Meanwhile, my mind was waging war on itself. My world had been turned upside down, and I didn't know what to believe anymore. All I'd known about werewolves were that they were bloodthirsty and power-hungry killers. All I'd known about mates were that they were someone you were forced to be with. These creatures didn't care. They weren't capable of it. I let out a weak reply. I don't know what to say. He let out a heavy sigh. I know you don't feel the same way. Samantha. I looked up, only to see him continuing to stare straight back at me. Though their safe dark color seemed to glow. Suppressed words and feelings were written across his face, but I was too afraid to delve into their meanings. I wasn't ready to be betrayed again. Look, Samuel started, finally breaking eye contact. He moved one hand to his neck and rubbed it. All I'm asking for is a chance. I hesitated, looking for the right words. I don't know if I can. He slowly nodded. How about a chance of a chance? I lightly laughed and rolled my eyes. Chapter 20 Wolves Part 1 maybe is good enough for me. Samuel smiled. It lit up his face and I realized how much better he looked with that expression. His eyes scrunched at the side to reveal faint smile lines. All other worries and anger erased with one emotion. What are you smirking about? He suddenly asked me. I shook my head lightly. Nothing at all. He let out a light breath. Well, what else do you want to know? Why are they keeping us here? I thought for a moment. I mean, why don't they just kill us? Samuel half laughed. Like they could. That wasn't my question. I responded as I rolled my eyes. Samuel shook his head. These people are trying to get to the pack. I told you that already. I know. What I'm asking is how. How could they get to the pack this way? And I could see that he was sure he wanted to answer my question. I gave him a look though, and he slowly continued. Leverage. I raised my eyebrows. Leverage. It doesn't really matter. It's not going to work. Samuel, just answer my questions. I was growing more annoyed at how he was dancing around me. What do they want? Clearly not happy that I hadn't dropped the subject. They probably want to make a trade. Trade for what? They're people for us, he told me slowly. Testing the waters. You mean the werewolves have a 10, but a hole in the ground too. I laughed, trying to keep the mood light. Not exactly. Samuel smiled. Well, why do you keep them? To my agent extraordinaire, Martin Noban, Heartfelt thanks for your unfair and patient enthusiasm. I thought for a moment. I was oblivious to the casualties and situations of the war, but I couldn't wrap my head around why a pack of werewolves would keep humans hostage. Normally they killed on sight. They're part of the resistance. Samantha, they broke the laws and have to face the consequences. So, it's true you kill them. To my agent extraordinaire, Madame Noben, heartfelt thanks for your unfair and patient enthusiasm. Or do you just keep them locked up forever? Samuel stared at me for a hard moment. Like I said, they're part of the resistance. I can't change the laws and consequences when they're broken. These people knew what they had coming. I paused as I let his cryptic words sink in. Rumors had always floated around the town, especially when it came to the werewolves. No one outright spoke of it, but hushed whispers always filled the street when someone went missing. Sometimes you saw them again, and sometimes you didn't. Some said they'd escaped, some said they'd been killed, and some say the werewolves kept them in prisons until their bones decorated the floor. So it's going to happen to me. I continued. I hadn't thought about it until this moment, but it'd been caught running and therefore it'd broken their law. If I didn't manage to get out before Samuel dragged me back to town, there was no way of telling what punishment they'd inflict. Samuel's mouth opened slightly as his eyebrows furrowed. He bowed his head and rubbed his jaw, avoiding my gaze. I waited silently for him to answer. However, instead of answering me, he abruptly stood up and started pacing the small prison. I watched as he took large strides in each direction, crossing the room again and again without effort. The room suddenly seemed much smaller, and it was slowly suffocating me. "Why did you run?" he abruptly asked me. I looked at him, confused. What does that have to do with anything? His steps quickened. If you ran because of your step, father, things are different. A weight settled on my heart. That was part of the reason. Sure, but it was the only thing on my mind when I ran. I looked up to see Samuel had stopped pacing and was staring at me. I averted my gaze and looked to the ground. I started to lie, but I knew it was useless. "I'm not really sure you want to know my answer." I spoke slowly. His body stilled, but he kept his eyes trained on me. After a moment, he looked to the ground and snarled. Great. Annoyance tugged at my heart, but I tried not to let it simmer. Samuel resumed his never-ending walk, sending glances my way every now and again. His face was scrunched in concentration and his hands were constantly moving between resting on his hips and neck. I tried to ignore him, but it wasn't working. "What are you thinking?" I finally asked. He glanced my way again but didn't respond. I huffed in annoyance and repeated my question. This time, he didn't even look at me. He just kept up his incessant pace, sending my nerves into a frenzy. I glared at him as he walked, wishing I could pick apart his brain. If what awaited me at home was worse than rotting in this dirt hole, I wasn't going to face it. I would die before I let them hold me in a prison for the rest of my life. Suddenly, an idea came to me. I started slowly, gauging Samuel's reaction. "You said you didn't tell anyone where I was going. No one really has to know what happened." He abruptly stopped pacing and looked at me, confused. "If it's going to be that bad for me, we could just tell people I was kidnapped." His eyebrows raised as he ran a hand through his hair. Still, he refused to speak. The pacing had stopped though, which was a slight improvement. It could work, I encouraged, noting his tense frame. "I know it could work. That's not the point." He finally answered. "Then what is? We can't just lie and duck under the law. Under the Alpha." Yes. Actually, we can." He suddenly glared at me. "No, we can't." "Why not?" I returned his scowl. "Because the laws are there for a reason." I shook my head, deepening my scowl. The laws the werewolves enforced were absurd and hypocritical. One of their own could go home and beat his mate every night. But if a human tried to run, steal, or even look at a werewolf from, the world suddenly stopped spinning. My lips turned into a grimace as I stared at Samuel. He was defending the very thing that sent this world and my life to hell. He took my grimace as worry as he quickly softened his features. Look, I'm going to fix this. No one's going to hurt you. I just don't know what to do. Yet, I need to talk to Riley. He raised his palms in surrender and smiled softly. I, however, wasn't swayed so easily. I didn't respond to Samuel's reassurances, but instead folded my arms and stared at the ground. Eventually, I heard him sit down as well, though it was far away from me. When he sat down, I shifted my gaze and looked up towards the trees. Freedom was so close. I could see it. But there was absolutely no way I could climb out of this hole. There wasn't even a way I could bribe myself out. I hadn't seen a single person since they threw me down here. My constantly dry throat, empty stomach, and bloody clothes reminded me of that. I heard Samuel sigh. Look. I whipped my gaze towards him and deepened my scowl. He flinched back slightly, opening his mouth. Words almost left his lips when he went deathly still. He jerked his head upwards toward the setting sun, holding a hand out for me to stay quiet. I did as I was told. Immediately following his gaze, I searched the opening for some sign of movement while my ears strained to hear anything but my own heartbeat. We stared in tense silence for a few long minutes. Samuel never moved and never told me what was going on. Eventually, his frame started to relax. He shot me a worried smile before looking upwards once more. When I heard rustling above us, I slowly mimicked his movements and looked to the sky. However, it was sky that I saw. It was the large head of a dark wolf. Chapter 21 Wolves, Part 2. The large wolf stared down into our hole for what seemed like an eternity. Its eyes lazily glanced at me before moving to Samuel, where they'd been resting ever since. The wolf's gaze would occasionally glance upwards and look around, but it would always return to stare down Samuel. Samuel's face remained expressionless, despite the fact the wolf and he were seeming to silently communicate. However, the only information I could gather from their looks was an untold thought dancing in Samuel's eyes. The wolf's head started to creep away. I met Samuel's gaze and he gave me a once-over. My expression turned to a scowl as he smiled apologetically and opened his arms. He started to speak but was cut off by a smooth voice echoing from above. I know you miss me, Samuel, but you didn't have to dig your own grave. I whipped my head upwards to see a man smirking down on Samuel and me. Thick and tousled brown hair fell around a bright and mischievous face. Sharp eyes bore into our own, but it was impossible to tell anything else. The sun was burning against the man's back, casting his face into long and untelling shadows. Samuel suddenly laughed. I just cowled and helped myself. Why? My breathing was cut off as my eyes darted wildly between the two men. I'd already blame you there, Sammy boy. Riley chortled. Now tell me, is this the mate I've heard nothing about? I suddenly felt Riley's eyes burning into my shoulders. I kept my gaze down but quickly glanced to Samuel, just in time to see him shrug his shoulders. Let's do introductions later. You want to tell me what's going on up there? I already told you. Riley shook his head as he glanced up momentarily. There's not a lot going on. It seems like they're all in the house. Stupid sons of bitches didn't think anyone would get into their camp. How many are there again? Close to 60. It seemed about a third or a little more were fighters. And the rest? Probably their families. Samuel finished with a glance my way. I met his gaze and deepened my scowl, folding my arms and pushing myself deeper into the dirt wall. I heard Riley shuffling around above us, but neither Samuel or I paid him any mind. Samuel kept my gaze, his eyes searching my features. You got the bullets? Riley suddenly asked. Samuel kept my gaze for a moment longer before he shifted his weight and slowly stood. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small bullets, holding them up for Riley to see. I looked at his fingers and swore I could hear the skin sizzling as the material burned deeper into his fingertips. Riley nodded at us as his face suddenly disappeared for a moment. In that moment, Samuel expertly threw each bullet towards the sky. They smoothly passed through the silver bars where they fell into Riley's extended hand. He inspected them each for a moment, while they burned small holes into his palm. "This is pretty pure. How did they get it?" I didn't exactly have time to ask them that. Samuel rolled his eyes. "Well, that was helpful of you," Samuel mumbled under his breath while he sat back down. I shrank further into the wall as Riley's face appeared once more. "Watching her. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Noble. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." I knew his eyes were resting more on me. It was impossible not to feel the heavy glare. "You know what? I'm going to need you to shift," Riley suddenly commanded Samuel. Samuel stilled for a moment. "Why?" "Because I need to tell you what's happening and don't want the human to hear." I glared at the figure above me. Samuel hesitated for a moment and I felt his weary gaze rest on me. A second passed and I was surprised when I heard his bones start to crack. I shook my head and brought my gaze to the ground as the sounds filled my ears. My hands clenched into fists around my knees as I pulled them against my chest. The position burned like hell, but it only fueled the fire rising inside of me. My brain was slowly wrapping around the situation and my thoughts were turning to rage, drowning out everything else. I didn't bother to look at the two as they conversed. Didn't bother to take notice of Samuel's large blonde wolf dominating our prison. My teeth clenched as I thought of the previous night. It'd been weak, tired, and vulnerable. My mind was still wrapping around the fact that not only had I been caught while on the run, but had been shot and thrown into a makeshift prison. Samuel saw my weak state and manipulated me in a moment of pain. "To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Noble. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." He feigned concern. He made me believe he was considerate. I squeezed my eyes shut tightly as I forced back tears. They weren't tears of sorrow, but a token of pure anger. It let my guard down, even though I knew I should have expected this from him and nothing less. This was all he was capable of. Now it was just one more tally mark on a list of my mistakes and misplaced trust. The conversation didn't last long, and much too soon I heard bones cracking once more. Scuffling sounded above as Riley took off running, but only silence greeted me from Samuel. He shuffled around his side of the hole as he pulled his pants on and breathed a little heavier. For a few moments, I could tell he was standing in the middle of the room staring at me, probably expecting me to explode at any given minute. Honestly, I waited for that moment as well. Eventually, I felt him start walking towards me. I whipped my gaze up and sent him a look of death. Every feeling of anger and hatred I could muster was put into my expression as I used it to dare him to come one step closer. It worked for a moment as he suddenly stilled mid-step and took a deep breath. His face was tentative and afflicted, but I refused to soften my glare. I was determined to make him squirm as long as possible. He stared wide-eyed at me for a moment before slowly sinking to the ground where he sat. Uncomfortably. I don't think I've ever seen a glare like that. You could win a contest. Samuel laughed once, attempting to lighten the mood. It didn't work. Now that he was sitting, I tore my gaze away and rested my chin on my knees. I stared at the wall as if it was suddenly the most interesting thing in the world when in reality, it was the only distraction keeping me from tearing across the room and slapping Samuel in the face. Samuel shifted his weight and spoke slowly. "I know you're mad, but in my defense, we aren't getting out of this without him." I scoffed but stayed silent. My words were simmering, waiting for the right moment to be unleashed. He would have come anyway. It just would have been a matter of time. Samuel tried again. I rolled my eyes as justification. He could do no wrong. If I didn't talk to him when I caught to him, then I caught to he wouldn't have killed everything in his path looking for me. This was the best option. His words danced in my mind, and my eyes snapped closed. I could tell Samuel was growing impatient, but his irritation only fueled my own. He lowly growled as he tried again. "You can't be mad, Samantha. I was just doing what's best." I saw it. I saw furious, dark, burning fire that defeated any and all other senses. "I can't be mad," I breathed out, slowly opening my eyes. "I can't be mad," I questioned again, raising my gaze to Samuel's. His face was contorted into an unreadable expression, but I saw the fire dancing in his eyes too. I was challenging him and he was gladly accepting. "You have no right." My voice was low, barely above a whisper. My hands were trembling as I felt the fire encompass every limb. "I have every right," Samuel stated, his short fuse starting to burn. I shook my head and scoffed. "To think that I trusted you for even a moment." I let out a harsh breath. "You've just proven everything." A low rumble came from Samuel's chest. "Samantha, you need to calm down. Don't you dare tell me to calm down," I beat out. He took a deep breath. "You're acting irrationally. You're in pain, hungry, tired, and you're not thinking straight." Though his words were calm, his voice was dangerous. "I don't want to do this. We'll be out of here soon and then we can talk. You have no idea what I am thinking. Samuel, don't even try that with me." My voice was slowly rising. "You're being ridiculous." I snapped. I snapped hard. "If you think in being ridiculous, you better look in a goddamn mirror." I was only doing what's best. Samuel suddenly matched my temper. I shook my head wildly. "You have no idea what's best. All you think about is yourself. You have absolutely no right to go around trying to tell me what I should feel and how I should act. You have no idea what the hell is even going on." "What the hell is going on then?" "Samantha, what piece of information did I miss apart from you running away and causing all of this? If you would have just listened, then we wouldn't be in this shit hole in the first place. Do you think I wanted you to come after me?" I suddenly roared. "What do you think I was running from?" Samuel stilled, closing his eyes. His voice lowered considerably, adding to the danger. "We both know that's bullshit. You were planning to run long before you met me. Stop blaming me for your mistakes. The only mistake I made was not running sooner. You lied to me. You outright lied to my face. Just so you could please your goddamn alpha and drag me back to hell. You think that town is hell. I know it is." Samuel suddenly stood and advanced towards me. He stopped a few inches shy of my shaking frame. "You have no idea what hell is. You think you could survive a single day out there." His hands flew upwards. "You're so goddamn naive. If you knew what was really out there, you'd be crawling back to me, begging for protection." I shot up, holding my side tightly with both hands. Though I was head shorter than Samuel, I stood tall with every inch I had. I've survived daily beatings for more than half my life. I've survived living in a town where every person I meet wants to kill me for being nothing more than a human. I've been on the brink of death, and you know what? I survived that too. I've watched people I know, friends and neighbors, be slaughtered by the dogs you call family. I watched my brother almost die at the hands of one of you. I've seen my mother beaten every single day of my life, knowing that if I did anything to stop it, I'd wind up dead myself. I paused, my entire frame now shaking. Small tears escaped my eyes and fell down my cheeks, landing in the dirt. "So if you think I can't handle myself, you are sorely mistaken." I finished my rant and looked directly into Samuel's eyes. His expression narrowed as his lips turned up into a snarl. "That may be true, but there is far worse. I've been there. I've lived it. You think you're the only one who's had it rough." He bit out. "You have no idea what's really out there. All I've done is try and protect you. But you're just senseless to ever realize or admit that." I stand by what I said. You wouldn't make it today. What could you possibly have hard in your life? You have everything. I threw my arms to the side, staggering slightly. Samuel tried to steady me, but I flinched back and continued. "You're practically in command of the pack. Everything you could ever want is given to you. You work for nothing and you take everything. Have you ever had to worry about a next meal? Have you ever seen someone you love die? Have you ever feared for your life? How could you possibly tell me you've lived anything other than a life of luxury?" Samuel tried to speak, but I cut him off. "You can't. You will never know what it's like, Samuel. And because of that, you will never understand. All you'll ever be is a moronic wolf who thinks they cheers better than anything and anyone." Samuel glared at me, eyes wild. You know nothing. You think you have this hold on the world, but in reality you're just a scared girl who's running from her problems. You think you've got me pinned down. Do you have any idea what I did to get here in the first place? He shook his head and opened his mouth, but no more words came out. I waited for his remark, for a degrading retort, but none came. He remained frozen in place, just inches away. His arms were at his side, with his hands were slowly clenching and unclenching themselves. His face was slightly flushed, eyes were starting to match the red color. I knew he was on the verge of shifting, but I didn't care. I stood my ground. I was done rolling over for him. So carefully, I watched as he took several deep breaths, never moving an inch. After an eternity, his voice met my ears as barely a whisper. You don't know me, Samantha, so it's a jest you stop acting like you do. I met his tone. What else is there to know? Your actions have spoken pretty loudly, louder than your so-called proclamations of what you think is love. You asked for a chance and I gave you one. You blew it. Samuel slowly shook his head. In not letting you go, and in not letting you have me. His fists raised to his temples as he stared me down. Before I could say anything more, he spun on his heel and stalked to the other side of the hole. He began pacing back and forth, his feet viciously digging up the dirt in their path. I carefully watched him and let out a long breath, leaning back against the wall. My hands returned to clutch my throbbing side and I closed my eyes, only now realizing the pain had worsened. Slowly, I slid down the wall until I was sitting in the dirt once again. Samuel didn't seem to notice my actions as he kept furiously pacing. I let several tears flow from my eyes as I watched him, my anger still playing on the chords of my heart. I was no longer blinded by it, but I felt as if no other emotion would ever take its place. I remained in my same position for a long time. Eventually, Samuel stopped pacing and sat across from me. Neither of us had spoken, but there was nothing more to say. The longer we sat in silence, the harder I fought against the fatigue that wanted to pull me into its arms. Samuel, on the other hand, couldn't have been more alert. Every echo of a sound and he was tensed and ready to spring forward. I couldn't help but grow annoyed by his actions, as they were threatening my heart with anxiety instead of the familiar anger. Suddenly, a dull and faraway swarm of voices was heard from above. Samuel jolted up from his sitting position and, despite my glares, came to practically stand on top of me. My legs started to push him away, but he forcefully held out his hand. I don't care what just happened, but you need to listen to me now. They're coming. Chapter 22 bound. I stilled at his words. They're coming. I looked wildly up towards the sky, expecting to see heads peering down at any moment. Samuel was practically standing on top of me now, hiding most everything from view. Who's coming? What's going on? I harshly whispered. He looked down at me for a moment before whipping his gaze back up. All you need to know is we have a plan. Samuel rushed. Just stay with me and you'll be fine. I started to ask more questions, but they were cut off by a noise directly above us. I peered around Samuel's large frame to see the silver bars up above slowly raising towards the sky. Shadow figures were lifting up the heavy metal while others were scattered around working along the edges. I struggled to make out their faces and recognize even one of them, but the setting sun made it impossible to distinguish anything but shadows. Once the bars were out of sight, a few of the figures started moving away. As they disappeared, though, one person emerged. They came to the edge of the hole, like all the others, but stalled once they saw us. I noticed hair falling around the shoulders of the figure as they tucked their hands behind their back. Here's how this is going to work. The person spoke. I immediately recognized the voice of Maria, the silver-haired woman who everyone seemed to worship. As she spoke, two other people came to stand next to her. They stretched something between them, holding the edges about a foot apart from each other. Maria nodded to the couple and they released part of what they held. It fell down the dirt wall of our prison, swaying as it came to a standstill around Samuel's waist. Now that it was closer, I recognized that it was a thick, roped ladder. Samantha will come up first, then you. If you try anything, we will not hesitate to shoot." As she spoke, I heard the easily recognizable clicking of a trigger locking into place. I quickly started to get up and make my way towards the ladder, but Samuel held me down with one hand. He shot me a glance, silently telling me to stay in place. When Samuel was sure I was going to move, he looked at Don Maria and lowly spoke. "We come up together or not at all?" Don Maria sighed. "You're not in the place to be making demands." To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nelbay, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I am. We're happy to stay down here for as long as we need. My eyes widened. I tried to stand again, but Samuel's hand was still holding my shoulder down. My eyes darted to Don Maria, who was still as a statue, watching us with a never-ending calculating stare. I gripped Samuel's leg, grabbing his attention. "Samuel, I'm not." "Wait," he whispered so only I could hear, squeezing my shoulder. Then, he lifted his voice to Don Maria. "We come up together or not at all." At Samuel's words, the two people beside Don Maria began to raise the rope ladder. I watched in horror as it rose above my reach. It continued to ascend and neither Sheen or Samuel moved to stop it. They stared each other down as the rope kept climbing, inch by inch. Then suddenly, Don Maria held out her hand. The two figures holding the ladder immediately stilled. The rope just a feet from the surface. Don Maria continued to stare but said nothing. She eventually nodded to Samuel, who immediately turned to face me. As he did, she disappeared from view. A couple more people replaced her and took the rope, binding it down to something in the ground. "Get on my back," Samuel lowly spoke as he lifted me up by my forearm. I quickly obliged. I sprang from my position, holding onto Samuel's arm for support. When I was steadily standing, he crouched down low enough for me to climb onto his back. I hesitated only slightly, glancing between the rope that had just been dropped down and Samuel's bare back. My stomach churned at the thought of holding onto him so intimately. Samuel noticed my small hesitation and turned to face me, sending me a careful look. He held my gaze for just a moment before turning to face forward again. I shook my head and took a shaky breath, trying to calm myself. This was the only way out. Once we were above ground, I could take off running and never look back. That was the driving thought in my mind as I felt my arms wrapped around Samuel's neck. He grabbed my legs and hoisted me further up as he slowly stood, adjusting my weight against his own. I bit back a gasp as the movement stretched my side, making it feel as if my body was being torn apart. Samuel noticed my discomfort. "I'm sorry, but this is going to hurt. Just hold on and try not to choke me." I immediately loosened my grasp around his neck, causing him to chuckle slightly. He walked towards the ladder and gripped the thick rope, pulling against it forcefully. When he was satisfied with the strength, he turned his head to the side a bit. "To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nelbay, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." I quietly nodded my head while burying my face in my arm and preparing myself for the misery of the climb. Samuel wasted no time as he caught hold of the rope and hoisted us upwards, his feet catching on the rope beneath us. We swayed slightly, but Samuel was quick with his movements. He didn't hesitate as he moved from one rung of the ladder to another. I, on the other hand, struggled. Samuel kept in a prey posture, but the gravity pulling against me was straining muscles that I didn't know I had. I involuntarily tightened my grip around his neck and shoulders, my legs doing the same around his waist. I squeezed my eyes shut as I tried to concentrate on holding on instead of the burning pain from my side slowly eating me away. Samuel whispered encouragements to me, reassuring me we were getting closer and closer to the top. After what seemed like an eternity, our bodies finally met the solid ground. Samuel gently took me off his back and set me next to him. I clutched my side as I sharply breathed in, willing the pain to leave. Samuel was on his knees as well, breathing heavily and taking in our surroundings. I quickly followed suit and stilled. We were surrounded by half a dozen people, each of them pointing a weapon at us. Some held knives, Some held what looked gloves, and a select few held a gun. I winced away from those, unknowingly falling into Samuel. He gripped my shoulders tightly, pulling me up to stand next to him. As we stood, I saw more people behind the ones directly in front of us. People seemed to surround us in every direction. Some walked towards us, some watched from afar, and some hid behind trees to catch a glance. But each of their eyes held the same things: apprehension. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. And most of all, to my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. As soon as I got my bearings, they were suddenly ripped away. I was being pulled away from Samuel by foreign hands that fiercely gripped my forearm. Samuel still had his iron grasp on my other arm though, and I suddenly found myself being stretched between two people. Samuel was careful not to pull me, but the other person didn't care for my comfort. I struggled against their grip as it grew tighter and tighter, never yielding. I whipped my head to face whoever it was that was pulling me away, only to be met with the glare of one of my personal demons. Her curls bounced wildly as she scowled at me, suddenly releasing her grip. Samuel, however, was done. He darted in front of me, barreling towards Margaret with his teeth bared. The minute he moved though, Margaret lifted her hand and pointed the barrel of a gun at my head. Samuel stilled, breathing heavily. He was facing me now, our torsos almost touching. Do we need to remind you what happens when you don't do what we say? Margaret suddenly spat. Samuel snarled but was cut off by Doma speaking from behind us all. That's enough, she demanded. Now this is simple. We do this without a fight or we'll kill you both. Samuel continued breathing heavily, not moving away from me. His hands found their way to mine where he grasped them tightly. He turned his head to look at me and I did the same. I could tell he wanted to tell me something, but he never got the words out. The minute Samuel complied, we were being forced to our knees by a new swarm of people. They quickly circled around me as one of them bound my wrists behind my back, while another wrapped a piece of cloth around my mouth. As soon as they were satisfied, I was forced to my feet again. Margaret appeared at my side with the all-too-familiar gun pointed at my head. Her other hand grabbed the rope around my wrists, pulling me towards her. As she did, I heard a large growl pierce my ears. I whipped my head to the side to see countless men wrapping Samuel in rope and gagging him as well. He tried not to fight against them, but I could tell every part of his body wanted to tear them to shreds. A new person suddenly appeared in the crowd, but he kept his head down low. He moved slowly to Samuel, placing his hand on a shoulder of whoever was in his way. They each parted immediately, giving this new and direct access to bound and gagged Samuel. My heart lurched as his eyes quickly found their way to mine, a pained expression lining each and every one of his features. He didn't notice the man walk up to the side of him, something long and pointed coming down to the skin upon his arm. As soon as I noticed what it was, my eyes widened and let out a small cry. Samuel turned, but he was quick enough. A needle was plunged into his arm, inserting a thick substance into his body. He roared in agony as he fell to his knees. His body began to convulse as his limbs tightened until his entire frame went limp. The man with the needle walked away slowly, and it was then that I realized who it was. It was hard not to miss the long dark hair, the tanned skin, enthusiasm, and the conflicted expression. His gaze lingered on Samuel before he looked at me and slowly started to advance, pulling another needle from his pocket. My eyes widened and I fought against Margaret, who only pressed the gun against my temple and tightened her grip on my wrists. Hot tears fell from my eyes in what felt like an ever-ending waterfall. Kate was standing next to me now, a pained look lining his face. His eyes darted between my eyes and the arm before he turned to look behind him. People began to disperse as Don Maria emerged and caught his eye. His voice came out slow and unsure. "She's not fighting. Maybe we don't have to. Stop being such a coward and do it. Margaret suddenly growled. Enough. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Logan. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing Quixote's enthusiasm. Damaria swiftly demanded. Cade, this is the only way. Do you want them back or not? Cade bowed his head and closed his eyes. After a moment he opened them and looked at me again. A newfound light of determination glinting in his expression. The world seemed to slow down as he brought the needle to my arm and thrust it into my skin. There was a small sting followed by the pain of a thick substance entering through the tip of the needle. I tried to fight as the liquid started taking its toll on me, my limbs growing heavy and weak. Cade caught me as I fell forward, my knees getting out from underneath me. He held me tight as darkness ensued, eventually consuming my mind. Chapter 23 The Alpha. I awoke to someone shouting. I tried to focus on the sound, but it was impossible. My senses refused to back to me, and it seemed as if I was fighting against some unknown force to let me stay awake. I desperately tried to distinguish who the familiar voice belonged to and what it was saying, but each time I tried I failed miserably. The words were loud and harsh, but that was the only thing I could really tell. I tried opening my eyes. I'm not sure if I succeeded or not because what I saw confused me. Globs of green, grey, and brown mushed together in blurry and swirling circles that danced before me. I blinked heavily time after time, but the formless shapes kept changing. Darkness surrounded them and myself, playing around the edge of my vision, beckoning me as if I were an old friend. I tried to feel my surroundings, but again, that only confused me. My head was heavy and laying on my chest. My legs were extended awkwardly in front of me. My arms, however, were nowhere to be found. They disappeared behind my shoulders, and no matter how hard I tried to pull them forward, I couldn't. Something held my hands and fingers together so all I could feel was my own clammy flesh. I don't know how long I sat like that, unknowing, confused, and terrified. The voice could still be heard, but it did nothing to try and help. It just kept screeching. Something told me not to make any noise and alert them though, and I happily obliged. I didn't want to be on the receiving end of those screams. Too much time passed before eventually, the shapes in my line of sight started to make sense. I understood the blobs of brown and green to be trees. The darkness was the night closing in. The grey was something far off, some sort of structure. Again, something told me I knew what it was, but nothing would click into place. I heard another noise, but this time it was much closer and coming from directly next to me. I waited for my head to feel less heavy before I brought it to rest on my shoulder, my gaze shifting to the space where I heard the noise. Most of what I saw was once again darkness, but as my eyes continued to adjust, I was able to make out a large figure slumped against what I deemed to be another tree. The figure was moving, but soft grunts were coming from its lips. Then, it all came back. The night hit me as a heavy wave crashing upon every fiber of my being, pulling and pushing me against the tide. I tumbled and turned with every assault. My vision came back, my mind was cleared, and I knew exactly where I was and who I was with. 6 figures stood before me in a small clearing. A small white stone building sat in the middle of the clearing, the old safe house. But the figures made no move to go inside. They were each spread out a few feet apart from each other, staring at it intently. However, upon closer inspection, I realized it was the building they were staring at. One smaller figure was pacing back and forth the front of the structure, throwing her arms wildly in the air while letting profanities spew from her mouth. I realized it was her voice, Margaret's, that had woken me up. Now that my ears were working again, I heard another voice too. This one was also female, but it was not shouting like Margaret. It was icy, stiff, and demanding. I couldn't make out the words, but I followed the sound to the shape of another woman standing in the middle of everyone else. The short white hair and tall frame revealed the woman's identity as Damaria. Though her frame was unmoving, I noticed her head flick to the side with any movement from the trees. She watched her surroundings carefully, waiting for something. After a few moments she snapped in Margaret's direction, and her shouting immediately died down. She stopped pacing and moved to stand next to the 3 other figures. I could tell they were men, but I didn't recognize them. I only recognized one other person from the group in front of me, and it was perhaps the one person I least wanted to see. Cade was standing slightly away from everyone else, though still close enough to clearly be a part of the group. He was standing on his toes, bouncing slightly. A large white box was held in his hand, and he kept incessantly fidgeting with the clasp. A few other supplies were next to him, things I recognized as towels, water, and a long and wide piece of wood. The soft grunts came from beside me once again, and I whipped my gaze around to find a barely conscious Samuel tied to the tree next to me. When I saw the ropes binding him, my own position made sense. Like him, my hands were tied behind my back, behind the large tree. I wasn't able to move or bend my elbows no matter how I tried maneuvering myself, and it seemed Samuel was in the same boat. I watched carefully the next few minutes as Samuel got his bearings. His eyes fluttered before they flew open wide, hastily scanning his surroundings. He saw the people in front of us first. The view of the crowd with their backs to us sent him into a frenzy as he viciously pulled forward, oblivious to the ropes binding him to a tree. When he felt the restraints holding him back, he whipped his gaze to fight against them. As he did, he caught my eye. His body immediately stilled as he scanned me once over. Then again, just to be sure, I offered him a small smile, though smiling wasn't exactly what I wanted to be doing in this situation. "Are you hurt?" he softly whispered. My gaze darted forward, watching the group in front of us. They hadn't seemed to hear Samuel, so I attempted to match his whispering. My voice barely came out, but when it did, it was hoarse and unrecognizable. "No, are you?" He let out a long sigh, eyeing the ropes behind my back. "What happened?" "I don't know. I just woke up. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Noble, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." He watched me through tired eyes and I bit my lip, taking in his tattered state. I didn't fail to notice how he ignored my previous question, but it wasn't hard to decipher why. Memories of his thrashing limbs reflected in my mind, and I closed my eyes, trying to hold back a flinch. Finally, I breathed out, "What did they do to you?" Samuel kept my gaze, but he fidgeted with his ropes. "I'm not sure. It felt like silver. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Noble, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." I broke eye contact and looked at my feet, trying to find a worthy distraction. I knew I was supposed to be angry with Samuel, but I couldn't focus on that. In this moment, he was who I was fighting against. It was the humans, my own people, that I now had to escape. "Have they said anything?" Samuel suddenly prodded. I didn't have to look up to know he was staring down the group in front of us. Margaret was really upset and was going off about something. I couldn't really make out the words. Cade was too, but he didn't say anything. I looked up at his confused face for a moment before my eyes darted back down. The woman next to Damaria and the man with the medical supplies. Samuel took a deep breath through his nose. "Cheers, the one you smelled like," he said loudly. It was his jacket. Yet, I replied without emotion. He looked at me pointedly and though I didn't want to talk about it, I reluctantly elaborated. "They're the ones who helped me out of town." He didn't say anything to me for a long time. I could feel his eyes on me. But again, I couldn't bring myself to focus on him. I had to come up with another plan. I knew Samuel's pack was bound to be out there somewhere, probably watching us right now. If that were true, they'd defree us. The minute they did, it'd run. Hopefully, they would all be too occupied with Damaria's group to notice my absence or come after me. It was a long shot, but it was the only option I could see. "Samantha, listen to me," Samuel eventually stated. I kept my gaze down. "Riley's going to be here soon and I don't know what's going to happen after that. I need you to stay by my side no matter what. To my agent extraordinaire, Love, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I thought he told you what was going to happen, I countered, ignoring his request. That doesn't mean HES going to stick to the plan. I laughed once but didn't respond. Samuel seemed to grow annoyed with this because he quickly asked me again. Samantha, please. I don't want you getting hurt and I don't know what Maria has planned. Oh, be careful, I slowly answered. He wasn't satisfied. I know what you're thinking and I'm telling you it's not going to work. You need to listen to me. Samuel was suddenly cut off by a loud noise coming from across the clearing. The trees next to the house started to move slightly as a powerful voice pierced the night. Dana Earborn. The voice loudly sneered. Our group all turned towards the sound of the voice as we watched 3 men come out of the trees. One man was in the middle with the other 2 flanking him. They each walked haughtily towards us as a large smirk grew on the face of the man in the middle. As they approached, the group in front of us shifted back until they were standing only a few feet in front of where Samuel and I sat. The 3 men continued their advances though, only stopping when the one in the middle held up his hand. Riley Matthews. Maria suddenly spoke, her voice cool. The middleman's face darkened. To my agent extraordinaire, Love, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I thought you'd have a little more respect, seeing that you did call on me. I stared at the man in the middle, taking him in. I'd only seen Riley once before, and that was just hours ago. That time, I hadn't been able to define much of his features. Now that I was able to take in his whole frame, I realized he wasn't what I expected. And it was unnerving. He had the typical werewolf build, large and broad shoulders, thick muscles, and clenched fist. But he was much taller than average. His height towered over every person in the clearing. However, it wasn't his height that demanded attention. The thing you couldn't look away from was his face. Bright red eyes shone constantly and thick 2-soled brown hair accentuated their color. I realized they were the same color that Samuel's eyes were each time he shifted. However, there was something more lurking in Riley's eyes. They were wild, unforgiving. They were the kind of thing you saw right before death. I held my breath as the 3 men suddenly looked towards Samuel and me. Riley's frame stiffened and his expression grew to the rage of 1,000 storms. Are you all right, Samuel? He ignored everyone else and spoke only to the man at my side. Samuel shifted, tugging on the rope behind his back. In fine. I assume you brought them, Maria interrupted, stepping into Riley's line of view. It was then that Riley nodded to the men at his sides. They both disappeared and reappeared a moment later, with a line of people being towed behind them. I widened my eyes at the sight. They each had ropes binding their hands and wrists and they were tied together like cattle being led to a slaughter. I counted 7 in total, men and women of all ages. They were all tired, their bodies dragging behind them as their wrists were pulled forward. My breath hitched as my eyes rested on a particular girl. She had familiar features and had to be the youngest one, no more than 17 years old. She, like the men and women around her, was struggling to even stand. My gaze shifted to the men that were holding the ropes, realizing that I immediately recognized one of them. To my agent extraordinaire, Love, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. It was hard to miss the icy, vacant expression of Peyton Bray. His hair was black and cut short, leaving no room for error in his sharp features. His thick and broad shoulders matched his arms and legs. The muscle beneath his clothing seemed to beg to be ripped out of its constraints. Looking at his small blue eyes, you could tell he was willing to let them. It made sense that HED here, as I knew he was 3rd in command. But still, his presence unnerved me. The group came forward until they were standing just behind Riley, who was now openly smiling. He looked at each person before him, his grin only growing wider. Maria noticed and quickly tried to take control. Give them to us and we will release these 2. She deliberately gestured towards Samuel and me. Riley cocked his head and faked a sigh. Where's the fun in that? He gestured behind him and Peyton grabbed the nearest person to him, who happened to be the girl he'd been studying earlier. When Peyton grabbed her, she looked around wildly, reaching out to another man that stood next to her. He was a bit older, but it was hard to miss the similar features. The more I studied them, the more I realized they had features exactly like someone else I knew. This man reached out and tried to grab the girl, but he was quickly pulled away from her. The young girl let out a cry as she was shoved harshly into Riley's arms. Damaria's group noticeably stiffened, and I heard something fall. My gaze whipped to where the noise came from to see Kate struggling to stand still. Achidi dropped the white box and medical supplies had been spilled all around him. A man held onto his arm as he pulled Kate back, but Kate only had eyes for the girl in Riley's arms. As she struggled, I noticed the man the girl had reached out to was fighting to get to her. Before he could accomplish anything, Peyton turned to him and forcefully locked his hands behind his back and around his neck. Riley stroked the young girl's matted dark hair. Such a precious thing. I assume she belongs to you. He pointed his smirk at Kate. Riley then noticed Peyton holding the other man and smiled wider. It seems they're both yours. Is that so? That doesn't concern you. Damaria spoke authoritatively, glancing to Cade. We had a deal. Now hand them all over. Yes, we did. Riley paused, looking down at Cordet's sister. She had her eyes closed and I noticed the gleam of tears on her cheeks. But it just doesn't seem fair to me. I mean, you get all of these humans back and a chance to live forever. What are you giving me? Again. Damaria narrowed her eyes. Your beta and his mate. I saw the two men behind Riley shift and exchange glances. Riley, however, seemed to already know what I was. He frowned and stuck out his bottom lip, a mock's-ed expression lining his features. I still don't see how this is fair. Stop playing games. Matthews. We had a deal. Riley suddenly sneered. He looked at the girl beneath him, his smile only growing as he watched her terrified expression. Yes, but you see, deals are so easily broken. With his last word, he placed a hand on either side of the girl's head and twisted, breaking her neck in one easy gesture. All hell broke loose.